It was yesterday, so what we're going to do today is look at what it feels like. Yesterday we looked at how we got here, being the bad guys, and today a bit, the touchy-feely, what does it feel like to be the bad guy? And what does it feel like to live as Christians in a setting which doesn't seem as Christian as it was? Really getting into that frame of it. And yesterday I started with Taylor Swift, that great philosopher-poet of America, and you laughed again. I thought I'd taught you. But anyway, today I thought, given that I went lowbrow, I would go highbrow with the philosopher-poet of America, Mike Tyson, who said, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth, right? And sometimes it's what it feels like. You've got your Christian kit, the way of thinking you're engaging with the world, your apologetic list of how old the earth might be, or what your apologetic on this issue is, or how God did create, and suddenly someone comes from nowhere and gives you a punch in the mouth. You homophobic, bigots, you people, you Christians are a problem in the culture, you're gnarly, and you think, I've got all my guns facing this way, and someone punches me in the mouth that way. It feels like quite discombobulating. Why is it like that? Why does it feel like everywhere I go I've got to mind my P's and Q's? Some of you may not feel like that, but there's therapy for that, and you can sort that out. But it does often feel like that. It often feels like we've got a plan about how we should be Christian in the public square, and then we get a punch in the mouth. We see an Andrew Thorburn situation where we go, there's the guy who could probably retire without having the job of CEO of Essendon, and his business acumen and his CEO jobs in the past will do him well. But I ain't that guy. Or I ain't that woman, and I'm just starting on the career ladder, and suddenly I'm like, if I lose my job over my Christianity, or I don't get those promotions, that will make life a little bit more difficult. So why does it feel like it? But I think another great metaphor for what it feels like is, it feels like we're playing an away game now, not a home game. Christianity did feel like it was a home game. Now, I'm an Arsenal supporter. Arsenal lost 2-0 last night to West Ham, so God doesn't love me. And if you go down to the Emirates Stadium in Arsenal to play a game against Arsenal, if you're an Arsenal supporter down there, you can go to the pubs and stand on the table and have 2 pints and sing whoa, whoa, like this and be a bit of a lad. I wouldn't do that. Other people do that. I just watch. And that's a home game. You can sort of be a little bit bolshy. But if you want to go to the Etihad Stadium in Manchester to play against Manchester City, and you're an Arsenal supporter, here's what you don't do. You don't get to Manchester, get off the bus, go to the Manchester pub, stand on the table, 2 pints, and wave your face, and and strut and flex. You just don't do that because it's an away game. And somehow Christianity has struggled to figure out how to play an away game because we've had a lot of home game time. And even if people didn't see Christianity as the thing they wanted, we were the chaplain to the state. They'd bring us in to sort of bless everything and things like that. But here's an interesting observation. I was in, where was I? Bendigo this year, which is in Victoria. There you go. And the Bishop of Bendigo was chatting to me, and he said, here's how things have changed. Bendigo, which you would think regional area, a little bit more conservative, I would assume, even though the Premier lives there, he was not invited to the Anzac Day ceremony to take part or be involved at any level at the Anzac ceremony. Well, if you think there's one sort of quasi-religious experience in Australia that you're going to invite the religious people to sort of do the blessing thing, be Anzac Day, right? Greater life hath no man, etc., etc. But no, it wasn't even on the radar to invite the local bishop. And I thought that was really interesting. It was... how did that happen? It just felt like we'd shifted to be an away game where you're low down the list. Now, that's not a judgment call, it's just a reality. And I think what Christians have struggled with is, what does my stance need to be when things in the culture don't go my way? And your first stance can be, I'm angry. I should be allowed on the proverbial table with my proverbial 2 pints and sing my proverbial Arsenal home game song when things don't seem Christian in the culture. I should be allowed to be a little bit more miffed by that this is the way things should be. And whether or not they should be, because we know that the glory of God will fill the whole earth one day, it ain't It just isn't. It's an away game. And you'll get a punch in the nose, in the Mike Tyson way, if you stand on the table, proverbially, and think, this is my home game, you lot don't belong here. And those things have flipped. Now, they've flipped for my generation, the X-Gen generation, the Nirvana generation, as I call us, where we don't hate ourselves. No one hates us as much as we hate ourselves. But for younger people, they've always felt like it's an away game. And I want to just say, if you're young here today, and if you think you're young, probably not, if you're a young person here today, and if you're from the millennial downward, though even the oldest millennials are 40, it's always felt like an away game. So in one sense, if you're going to say, as an older person, how do we navigate this space? The irony might be you might need to speak to some younger people and see how they're going to navigate it, because they're the ones that are going to have to live it over the next 30 to 40 years in work and how to do church and how to do away game life. But I want to encourage you too that the Bible is an away game text at some level. As I said yesterday from the Huffington Post, it was a case of the Bible was a book written by losers for the benefit of other losers, cultural losers. Israel, though it was strong, was in the midst of the nations. The true prophets spoke to the Israel king, and the prophets were the losers, and they wrote the text, and the king was often against them. And Israel found itself in slavery, then it found itself in the desert, and then it found itself in exile, and then it finds itself personified in Jesus on a cross. And then new Israel finds itself as the diaspora, the scattered people of God that Peter writes to. And what was Peter's problem? He wanted home game until Jesus showed him otherwise. So he's able to write to the diaspora as exiles and strangers living in the land. And he imports the Exodus analogy and uses it in 1 Peter. And one of the classic verses, I think, in 1 Peter is he says, do not be surprised at the fiery trial you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. And that's part of our problem. We're surprised. You mean I'm the bad guy? How did that happen? Well, the Bible says, do not be surprised. And then you realise it isn't the meaningless thing that's happening to us. It's a fiery trial there to test you in the same way as the start of 1 Peter says it's there to burn off the dross in our lives as Christians. What if the temperature's been turned up on us over the next 30 to 40 years to see where we're really at, to see our untested virtues are actually virtues? That could be what God is, that beyond God. And at the end of 1 Peter, he says, after you have suffered, what's the phrase? A little while, the God of all grace and comfort will restore you. And in one sense, I feel that's the away game space you have to sit. Because I love that term, a little while, because you want to say, how long's a little while? Oh, just till Jesus comes back, it's okay. But it feels like Peter is stooping to us in childlike language, like you're sitting in the back seat of the car and you say to Mum or Dad, how long till we get home? Oh, just a little while. Just a little while. And we're in that little while stage. But that's God's people in all of history. We just happen to have lived through a blip in time where things have been a little bit easier for us in the West, where to go to church was seen as something, well, not that anyone was going to do it, but it was kind of moral. And now it's seen as, you guys got to get with the program. You're being bypassed. It's an away game. And it's an away game not because of the books you read. It's an away game because of the family members and the loved ones you have who aren't Christian, okay? And that hurts sometimes. And I get lineups after I talk about these things of parents going, my son, my daughter. So it's pastoral, isn't it? You know that the discipleship program of this world, as we'll talk about, is very alluring at the moment. It offers an amazing array of ways to flourish as a human that have nothing to do with Christianity. This struck me this is me without a beard, and that's my half-brother in the middle, tall guy, which shows that the sexual revolution kind of blew my family apart as well. That's my dad's second wife. My dad was dead by this stage. That's my dad's second wife in the middle, and that's my daughter, son, and my wife. About 2016. Year before the plebiscite, 2016. And that's my half-brother's wedding day, which I emceed. He asked me, I was a pastor, can you MC my wedding? It's really hard. And I go, oh, yeah, it's really... like a pastor can go, do this, do that, the toilets are out there. They can do that from the front, just don't ask me to run the ceremony. But I emceed his wedding. So it's a relaxing day. I'm only emceeing his wedding. We sat down at a table, and his wife is South African. My wife's also South African. And her brother and brother-in-law were at the wedding from South Africa. Now, you got that, didn't you? Her brother and brother-in-law married in South Africa to each other, and they had a young surrogate daughter, also at the wedding. Sitting at these long tables, Jill and I sitting there, and Bayers and Leonard sitting opposite us, and we introduce ourselves to each other. The year before the Australian plebiscite on marriage, where everything's sort of biffo, Mike Tysoning. And the first thing you ask someone is, what's your name? Bayers, Leonard, Steve, Jill. And the second thing they ask you is, what do you do? And, I was pretty honest. I said, I'm a used car salesman who sells fentanyl to young children after school, because that was easier than saying I'm a pastor of a church, because I know what's coming. And what came? What was the next question? From Leonard, who I get on well with, by the way, so it's not a problem. But, can gay people come to your church? Rabbit headlights, punch in mouth, and you're scrambling to think. And I said, of course, anyone can come to our church. Yeah. Now, he's not asking that, though. He's not asking, can I walk in the door of your church, shake hands with the person at the door, sit at the back and walk out, thank you. He's saying, can I be a fully fledged, paid-up member of your church who could perhaps lead the worship or be involved in the kids' ministry or whatever the things that we do? And I'm glad the next question didn't come because, Bayers saw it coming and headed that off at the pass. Smart man that Bayers is. But two things struck me that tell me how things have changed in our cultural moment. And this taps into the victimhood thing we talked about yesterday. Bayers and Leonard were able to be announced to us as husband and husband. 30 years ago, they would have been announced as friends of the family, because it would have been a punch in the mouth for them. Now, I'm not telling you the moral framework of that. I'm just saying that's what it feels like. For them, they would have kept their heads down about that. And the other thing was that he felt free to ask me that, knowing that I was on the back foot with my answer. He knew he was playing a home game and that I was playing an away game in the year before the plebiscite in Australia. He knew it. And he instinctively went there. Now, I said this to the young folk last night, but if I'd had my time again, rather than open myself up to a follow-up question that I might not have been able to answer and make that a very long dinner, I probably would have just started asking more questions. Oh, do you go to have you been to a church? Have you had a bad experience of a church? Because what I think we need to do in our apologetics going forward in this time, in this away game time, is go, if it is an away game and I'm not on the table holding the 2 beers, is start to ask more questions to get to the question behind the question that people are asking me. Find out what's really going on. Now, that doesn't mean to say you can't tell people what you think, but I think the first stance to take is go, let me ask you some questions first, because I want to know in an away game whether they're asking me those questions to determine the reason for the hope that's within me or determine the reason for the bigotry that they think is within me, because those are two very different sets of questions and frameworks. So that was an interesting experience, how that went. What was also interesting was that they send their daughter to a Catholic school, because upon arriving in Western Australia from South Africa, they were shocked and dismayed how hedonistic Western Australia was, with no values and no one talks about God and no one believes anything in this place. Interesting. Very interesting. So there's that aspect of an away game. The other thing I think as an away game is that people are non-Christian in a different way to how they were non-Christian in the past. So when Billy Graham did come, and when Chris did get saved, part of the message when you fill the MCG was, you Australians, you know what? You think you're Christian. But you know what? You're not Christian enough. You've got to be born again. You've got to be saved. You've got to move from thinking you're Christian to a subset within the centre of Australia that's really Christian, that's converted. Now, if you came to the MCG today, by any chance that Billy Graham filled the place and said, you Australians, you think you're Christian, what are most of them going to say? No, we don't. A good thing too. And if you do become a Christian in Australia, you don't become the Australians. The circle inside the big circle is kind of to the side. You move to what I call a creative minority or a minority group of Australians who aren't reflective of the average person in Australia. And we're non-Christian in a different way to how we're non-Christian in the past, because people in the past were non-Christian in a kind of Christian way. Do you know what I mean? The North Star that guided them was Christianity. And they would be either pulling away from the gravity of Christianity or being drawn towards that planet, that star. But when that explodes, what you get in Australia, as you get across the West, is the detritus of Christianity sort of floating around the place with no gravitational pull. So people are all over the place and they believe bits and bobs and small shards of things that have no coherence. They don't go, well, I'm not going to go to church and I'm going to live with my girlfriend and I'll be living in sin. No one thinks that way anymore. They thought that way but still did it, but no one thinks that way anymore. So grounding your conversations is very different. So people are non-Christian in a different way to how they were non-Christian in the past. And we don't necessarily appeal to the same things or the same way up front in how we engage with people. The other thing is that post-Christians are fundamentally different to pre-Christians. We're not heading back to the Rome of the first century, not in how we think, even as secular people. Christianity has so infused the culture that it's so embedded that it's the default, and we'll get to that in a minute. It is, as Glenn Scrivener says, and we'll point it out, the air we breathe. Post-Christianity is not the same as pre-Christianity. And the most anti-Christian white witch of Wiccan paganism who got in a time machine and went back to first century Rome would come back shivering and shaking at how Christian she actually was. And we'll explain that. Do you get what I'm saying by that? We assume a lot in a post-Christian framework that shows that somehow we're not quite as post-Christian as we think we are, and we're certainly not pre-Christian. Which means you have to do the hard work of reading 1 Peter and then applying it to our lives, because it's written into a pre-Christian Rome, and now it's written with Christianity's coming into the culture, and we're going to have to read it and apply it as Christianity's going out of the culture. There'll be some things that are the same in application and some things that are different. Now, this whole post-Christian, pre-Christian thing isn't just something that Christians are thinking about. People who aren't Christian are really interested in it as well, people like Tom Holland. Now, when I say Tom Holland, I always divide the room between those under 35 and those over 35, and everyone's expecting a young, hip-looking dude in blue and red spandex, but you get a historian called Tom Holland who wrote the book Dominion. And he says this, and I think this is absolutely critical. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from view. It is the incomplete revolutions which are remembered. In other words, you go to a place where there's been an attempted coup that fails, and the landscape is littered with the detritus of a failed coup, burnt-out tanks, pockmarks on buildings, things like that. But when a revolution wins, it just changes the landscape. It changes the buildings. It cleans up the area. It says, we're the new thing. And then eventually the new thing just becomes the thing that you assume. And Christianity is the thing that over in 2,000 years in the West, we assume. It's become a default. The incomplete revolutions are remembered, and the hidden revolution is the one that won. So the hardest thing today is trying to explain to people, because this is what you kind of want. Oh, you non-Christians, when you get rid of Christianity, it's all going to fall apart. It's going to be terrible. There's going to be dancing and fun and parties and all that nonsense. Oh, it's going to be awful. And then you look over the parapet of your cyclone-fenced compound. Sydney looks fun. Looks colourful. Everyone looks like they're having a good time. And you're waiting for the zombie apocalypse to come and it doesn't arrive. Where's my zombie apocalypse when I want to prove my theory that Christianity, once it's no longer the main thing, that people just... Now, hold that thought, because Mark Sayers says it is an apocalypse that we're experiencing in a post-Christian age, but it's what he calls a beautiful apocalypse. Very bright, very shiny, but it's a facade. It's held up by stuff. And as I said yesterday, one of the things that's holding it up is the mental health industry in Australia at the moment. There's deep anxiety in our cultural moment. One of the other things that's holding it up is the cultural storytellers who paint bright pictures about things that are ungodly and dark pictures about things that are godly. That's part of the issue. It's that transfer. But it's very hard to prove to people that Australia would have been much better if we just stuck with Christianity for everyone, because ostensibly we're not seeing the zombie apocalypse we've been hoping for. So that doesn't prove what we want. And so that's Tom Holland, and he's not a Christian. He's just saying that the Western world, the biggest impact in history so far, and he's an historian looking at it, boils down to, and he doesn't believe in the resurrection, boils down to the idea that the first Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's changed the world. In what we think, how we act, what we think about forgiveness, what we think about humility, what we think about what the virtues are and what the virtues aren't, what the vices are. All that's changed because of Jesus and the cross and that message. How women are treated, how babies are treated, how slaves are treated, how anyone's treated, changed because of the Christians' convictions that spread around the world, whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, he says. That's the revolution. And Glenn Scrivener, some of you may have read his book, The Air We Breathe. Anyone read that? Worth buying. It's probably the Cheats Notes version of Tom Holland, and it's not plagiarised. So Glenn will never be the president of Harvard or anything, but it's not. It's just a Christian evangelistic book about how to do life as a Christian and show the gospel to people who think all this stuff we get came for free. So the title of the book is How We Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. You can list all those words without ever talking about the word Christian, and in fact you could flip it and say those things are antithetical to what the Christian message has been, especially as it's dominated people and it's done terrible things. Freedom, kindness, progress, and equality. You can go to any HR department in any progressive secular company and those words will be in all of the documents. Right? We all came to believe in them, Christian or not, because the revolution was so baked into us that we can't see it. And the thing is that we assume that over the long period of time, those things will continue with Christianity taken out of the scene. That's a big assumption. And I don't think you can test it after 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe 30, 40 years. So what you have to do is sit in the tension of going, everyone seems to be on about freedom, kindness, progress, and equality, and it looks like it's working out for a whole bunch of people, but I don't agree with what they're saying, and I want to be proved right. You may not in your lifetime be proved right, culturally at least. You may have to sit in the space of being the away game person for the rest of your days. That's the way it goes. And one thing I said yesterday was, and I said it again today, is everyone feels like they've got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. Not everyone. We're not all getting a punch in the mouth. The media is perhaps giving us a hard time on stuff. Social media can give us a hard time on stuff. Check out Twitter or X, whatever it's called these days. But most people just don't care. Most people don't give a rip about Christianity. It has no bearing on their lives. You do realise that, don't you? Because you would prefer they were angry about it sometimes to being apathetic about it. You'd prefer it sometimes. No one is walking past our churches, pointing them out and saying, if I never go to church, that's the one I'm never going to. They simply don't see them. Despite the number of buildings we have, the church has a light footprint on our culture. And most people aren't thinking about it, responding to it. And if you could find a way to get someone to it, that'd be great. And when you plant a church, you hope that new people will come who aren't Christian. But even new church plants, dirty little secret of guys planting a church, are populated mainly by Christians. We don't evangelise churches into existence in the same way that St. Paul was evangelising the church into existence in Philippi, for example. That doesn't work that way in the West at the moment, unless you're working with Chinese national students on a university campus who are pre-Christian. Pre-Christianity and post-Christianity are very different in that sense. They simply don't see us, no matter what we put on, no matter what we do. It feels like we're invisible at that level. But Tom Holland still says that the West is still firmly tied to its Christian moorings. It's the invisible revolution that we just don't see. And the average secular person who still believes in freedom, justice, equality is a squatter on land that they did not purchase. That land was purchased with a Christian framework. It is not ubiquitous to the world. And Tom Holland points that out as he looked around as he was writing his book, Dominion, that when he says, we talk about universal human rights, but they're not universal. They're specific. And it's interesting that the places where same-sex marriage has come in are Western nations that were Christian. And the reason that's happened is because the biblical framework values the individual very highly. It does think that freedom of the individual and freedom of conscience, which has been brought in, and freedom of association, which are flower from the Christian ideas, it does think those things are important. Our countries still think those things are important, which is why we get the flowering of those things, post-Christian things, such as same-sex marriage as legislation, in Western countries only, generally. Places where Christianity has had a big footprint in the past. The footprint's been removed, but it's still the air we breathe. It just looks like, as Mark Sayers calls, the kingdom without the king, as we talked about this morning from Adam. So we have the Christian fruit, but when you cut the roots off the tree, at some stage it'll wither, right? At some stage it will wither. You'll eventually find that the Christian fruit will grow more sickly, a little bit more bitter. We'll talk about that in a minute. And eventually won't grow at all. So we are different to pre-Christian Rome, but give it enough time and launder out enough of these things from the culture and make sure the fruit doesn't grow, and you'll see some of those things come back, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But let me give you an example of how the Christian framework has so embedded itself in our cultural moment and way of thinking that non-Christians even think, in our categories, and use them against our own frameworks. Right? This is Ros Ward, the architect of the Safe Schools Coalition. And in the Guardian newspaper a few years ago, which the Safe Schools Coalition, if you don't know, was the schools project that was ostensibly about anti-bullying, but was really just a bit of a Trojan horse for bringing in gender theory, radical gender theory into high schools. And she said in the Guardian, "I will never give up fighting for a more free and joyful world." And I went, hey, there are words. You can't have those. We've got a hope in a free and joyful world that's coming down the line, and it's soon and very soon, or in just a little while. You can't have our words. Because they're not pagan Greco-Roman ideas that there's a future world that's better ahead of us, as we talked about yesterday. And they're not Eastern ideas that there's a free and joyful world ahead, because the whole cosmos is cyclical in the way it rolls out. It's Christian ideas. It's the air we breathe, and you can take Christianity out of it for quite some time and still have those ideas antithetical to the Christian framework. And Ros Ward is someone like that. I will never give up fighting for a more free and joyful world. And that's what Mark Sayers calls the kingdom without the king. This idea that we can have all of the goods of the kingdom without the king in the kingdom. And you know from the sin of Israel in the desert, when God says, okay, go up to the promised land. You can have it all, houses you didn't build, vineyards you didn't plant, but I'm not coming. Now, if I'd just seen 20,000 of my people slaughtered by God, this God who says I'm not, okay, we'll take that. You know, all the good stuff without the God, you'd take it. Except what does it say of Israel? They mourned, because they knew that the kingdom wouldn't be right without the king in it. It wouldn't be the kingdom. Something was lacking the centre of it. Yet that's what we're rolling out culturally at the moment. People want the kingdom, the equality, the justice, the freedom, but not necessarily the king who bought that for us. Now, there's a flip side to the kingdom without the king, and I want to explain that briefly. Because I think I'm the kind of guy that can harumph those progressives and their kingdom without the king. Rah, rah, rah. There's another version, because you see the pendulum swinging in our current moment from very strongly progressive to a real strong reaction against that. And I call it Christendom without Christ. Could I have the 1950s back? It doesn't matter if Jesus is there. Just give me the framework that makes me feel like I'm playing a home game. I don't care if my neighbours are saved. I don't care. And there's a hard right-wing response that doesn't have Christ at the centre of it. I think we've got to be very careful of those two things. And you'll be one or the other more led, I think, just according to your temperament. And it's worth reading Jonathan Haidt, the New York psychologist I quoted yesterday, on why we think the way we do about the moral frameworks we have and where they come from. His book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided on Politics and Religion, is worth reading, just to get to the core of not what other people think instinctively, but what you think instinctively and why. It puts a mirror up to you. So I said in Being the Bad Guys, this post-Christian culture has at its disposal the tools, terminologies, and categories of the Christian world, but utilises them in a way that are hostile to the Christian faith. I think that's true. There's still saints and sinners. It's just the category we've flipped around. We still have all the frameworks of justice and righteousness that the gospel gives us, but we've changed how they're used somehow. I think that's what's happening. Now, it's not all one-way traffic. So go back to Ros Ward. Maybe 8 or 9 years ago, before this all really kicked off, I was asked to come and speak at an Anglican school in Perth by a friend of mine who was the chaplain to the executive team, the senior leadership, just before the school year started. And I said, what do you want me to talk about? He said, the Christian view of sexuality. Great. So he was an evangelical. The rest of the staff, it was open employment, some Christian, some not, some very progressive Christians, some very, keep their heads down, kind of quiet, conservative Christians, but a mixed bag. I said, so what time do you want to come in? And he said, I want you to come in around 11 and do a presentation, but you're coming in the hour after the 2 girls from the Safe Schools Coalition come in and do their presentation. Oh, great, that's a hospital pass. No, I got there early and they left late, and it was like, it's like walking past your old girlfriend in Coles. It was awkward. But when I sat down to talk to the staff, I said, I'm going to guess that everything you heard before here was that sex is a destination. I said, how about I suggest to you that sex is a signpost and not a destination? How would that change your pastoral approach to how you're dealing with things in your school? Now, I said, when sex is a destination, everything revolves around that. But when sex is a signpost to a greater intimacy, it changes how you're going to pastorally care for the kids coming into this school. They were amazed by that response, in the sense that they hadn't quite thought about it that way. But the real kicker was, here's how the culture war bit came in. When a school of well-heeled young students who have a partnership with the parents and the teachers and the students together are told by the Safe Schools Coalition girls, if someone comes in and wants to wear the opposite clothes to their gender, don't tell their parents. Just let them come to school in what they're wearing and change their clothes at school. And the most progressive teachers went, we're not doing that. This is a partnership. This isn't a culture war issue. This is a pastoral concern that we share. So in one sense, sometimes people shoot themselves in their own foot when they're playing the culture war and they overreach. And you'll notice that in our current moment, that I get a lot of non-Christian people saying to me, just quietly, this seems really crazy. We can't sustain it like this. And how do I sign up to your Christian school? Now, my half-brother is not Christian. And you don't have to go very down far his Facebook page to see how not Christian he is. I have to censor it half the time. He's sending his kids to a Christian school from next year because he just says, what's going on? Interesting. So whether you feel you're playing an away game and it's hard, there are people asking some serious questions about the frameworks we're living in our cultural moment. Serious questions. I think the majority of people, though, in Australia just probably aren't thinking too much about it. Just trying to get on with their own lives and do what Australians do, because they all think they're on their own now, as Taylor Swift said. Cool news is you're on your own now. The majority of Australians are not culture warriors, they're not activists, they just want to have a good time for as long as they can. And Australia's a good place, well, Western Australia's a great place to do that. That's not too bad here. And you think, how do you even start to think about reaching anyone who's that? It's very hard. Last holidays, Jill and I and the kids went not far from where we live, actually, up past Perth, maybe just 40 k's, because we just want a local holiday, and we rented a really snazzy house in a new area called Mindarie Keys, with a marina just built. It looks like something from Italy. The water is blue, the sky is blue, it's warm, and that's the view from the back section of the house overlooking the marina. And you can see the rocks up there in the corner, which have sheltered. Well, to be honest, if you've been to Western Australia, if you try to go to the beach at about 2 p.m, you will get sandblasted. If you want to have great-looking skin, go down for an hour to the beach in Western Australia at about 2 p.m, any month of the year, January especially, and you get blasted by a strong westerly. You can't swim, it's dumping waves. It's not all beer and Skittles over there, I'll tell you that. But that part of the coast is particularly treacherous. You cannot swim at Mindarie Beach. It's got signposts, dangerous swimming area, do not enter. And the front door of that house, for all of how magnificent that looked, was tiny and it was salt encrusted, and it was almost like to get the door open or closed because of the wind, and it was just howling and the waves were pounding into the rocks on the other side. Even on days like that, it would be howling gale. and punching wind. But you look out the back and it's heaven on a stick. And one Sunday we went down there, it was just crammed with people because of expensive houses, big boats, lots of fun. It's a mining town, everyone's got money. And one Sunday night we went down to a restaurant for dinner and it was heaving with people. And I said to Jill, do you think, and having fun. And I said, do you think anyone even here thinks about Jesus ever? Ever? It just felt like this is Pleasure City. And most Australians, you know, their goal in life is to craft their own personal Mindarie Marina. A life of ease and comfort, setting their own agenda and how they want to live life. And for most of the time, they can buffer themselves from the reality that the vast percentage of the population on the planet is living. Right? But every now and then, a rogue wave comes over the top of people's personalised Mindarie marinas and threatens to wash them away. We call it suffering. And our culture has no category for it. The wind will pound the rocks and the waves will wash away your marriage, your job, your children, your health, someone's life, someone's mental health. And that's where there becomes a little chink in the armour, where people might start to think, maybe I need something more. And our biggest risk, as I said yesterday, as Christians, is not the bad life. It's the good life. Australia feels like it's there to give you the good life. Is that not true? And we are as susceptible to it as anyone else. Because when you look at the bad life, you go, I'm not going there, I'm not going to do that. And you look at the good life, and it's just a little incremental climb up to ease and comfort more and more and more until you could live a life without God that feels pretty good and just pay him homage every third week at church. Rory Shiner, he's way too smiley and got too much hair for me to like him, but I do, he's my senior pastor. He says this about our secular culture while we're all poring over books of how to reach our secular friends. We're not being out-thought by our secular culture, we're being out-discipled. Modern Australia, modern secular thinking is not all that smart. Most people here will have read more books around apologetics or secularism than the vast majority of people out there in Australia. You could have them for breakfast with an idea. But we're being formed by what we're immersed in all of the time. And you don't need to go to Babylon to work on Monday morning. You carry it around in your back pocket. It shapes you far more than you think. Rory's right. We're not being out-thought by our secular culture. We're being out-discipled. I don't think it's all despair. And Rory goes on, this isn't Rory, he's also smiley, but this is a great quote, and I'm going to read it in full. We are not argued into expressive individualism, that idea that it's you do you in the cultural moment. We are formed into it. To live in modern Australia is to be part of a relentless discipleship program. Every Pixar and Disney film, every graduation speech, every new novel and Netflix series is 100% on point. Your purpose in life is to find the true inner you and then to express that to the world. God is framed out. That makes sense? I think that's true. I think that's true. Your purpose in life is to find the true inner you and then to express that to the world. And anyone who says that can't be you is doing violence to you. God is framed out. It's not that you can't believe that God exists, but he has no bearing and no weight in the cultural frame. It's as if there's an invisible dome around the world. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. That's just the way it is. That's from Under the Dome, a book and then a series on HBO book by Stephen King, where this invisible dome goes over this town called Chester Mill and it's impervious to anything. I think most people live their lives that way, as if that's the way life is. Nothing breaks through. Here's the kicker, though. What you're starting to see now, I'll talk about it more tomorrow, is there's an itch for something more. There's an itch for something more. It turns out that the new atheists haven't proven to be the most popular over the last 5 or 10 years because no one's going to go to the wall for it. It won't fill anyone's imagination. You know, they can say as much as they like, we're all made of the same stuff as stars are made of. Yeah, but so are toads, So what's that got to do with it? Now, Tara Isabella Burton was one of those pagan Wiccan white witch ladies who became a conservative Roman Catholic. Odd but true. And she calls the current search among a younger generation of people in the West, she calls them, their religion is what she calls remixed. What we're seeing today in the West is typical of this. A sort of grab-and-go version of spirituality where I need something more than being told we live in this meaningless universe of which I have to make meaning and purpose. And she says this, today's remixed people reject authority, institution, creed, and moral universalism. The hunger for something spiritual is not yet seeing a drive back to the church because people look at the church and they see authority, institution, creed, and moral universalism. They value intuition, personal feeling, and experiences. They demand to rewrite their own scripts about how the universe and human beings operate. They want to choose, and more often than not, this is key, purchase the spiritual path that feels more authentic, more meaningful to them. Our battle is not going to be against atheism. It's going to be against a search for transcendence that's commercialized, consumerized, pick and mix. Thus saith the Lord is a very hard word to bring into that. She goes on to say this, the remixed hunger for the same things human beings have always longed for. And this is what she says are the marks of good religion, a sense of meaning in the world, personal purpose within that meaning, a community to share that experience with, and rituals to bring the power of that experience into achievable everyday life, but they're doing it differently. And she says they are doing that as they express themselves to the world. But she puts a warning in her book. When we are all our own high priests, who is willing to kneel? That's a killer line. She's a great writer, Tara Isabella Burton, or as I call her, Wednesday Addams. She looks like it. But what she's saying is that everyone's personal autonomy is going to come up face to face with everybody else's personal autonomy, and no one's going to want to back down, and no one will back down until someone has the power to make someone kneel before them again. We are going back to pagan Rome in the sense that power will be the way things are dealt with. And we're seeing that at the moment in our cultural battles. Who can get the power not to give everyone the freedom to live how they like, but to enact their vision of the good life and human flourishing? That's what's tearing Western worlds apart. In one sense, as Tom Holland says, the current culture war is a civil war within Christianity, or post-Christianity. It's two visions of human flourishing that have a goal in front of them, but very different ways of achieving them. It's the T world and the I world at war with each other. So there's a chink in the armour. But here we go back to our poet, scary news is you're on your own now. And I'll rattle through this and then give you time for questions, which will only be half an hour this time, sorry. Scary news is you're on your own now. Despite that vision of a great future, this is what the world doesn't feel like we're in a cable car going to a great progressive land that we were told that science would eventually bring us to and technology. That the Apple ads keep indicating we've got. It doesn't feel like that. And the problem is if you strap yourself into some sort of cocooned area that's going to be going along a track, and you think you're strapping yourself into a cable car and you strap yourself into that. We're on a roller coaster culturally. This is known as rapid discontinuous change, which is why I hate roller coasters. You go, and has that not been the last 20 years of politics, culture, law, everything? We can't keep a prime minister. That's the way it goes. We get a pandemic and we don't know what to do, and then we're worried about another one, and then a war breaks out here and it's like playing whack-a-mole. You push it down there and it pops up somewhere else. That's the way it is. And if I weren't a Christian in that time, I'd just be trying to build bigger rocks on Mindari Key, right? And what you notice is that people withdraw from public discourse and engaging in public activities at times of rapid discontinuous change. So you can't get a good volunteer in church these days. You can't get a good volunteer anywhere. Volunteerism is falling off the map. Activism's rising, but even activists, hard radical activists, which I read recently, but I haven't got the quote up here, said, "What? We can't keep people. We need to look like church. You go there and everyone loves you," and even the activists said this. They look after your kids, they give you a cup of tea. That's a low bar, but anyway, it sounds okay, right? And for all the triumph of the modern self, it's Tim Keller who says the modern self is exceptionally fragile. While having the freedom to define and validate oneself is superficially liberating, it is also exhausting. You and you alone must create and sustain your identity. This has contributed to unprecedented levels of depression and anxiety and never satisfied longings for affirmation. Among the generations where everyone got a trophy, because we thought that more self-esteem would actually solve the anxiety issue or the lack of affirmation issue, and how much affirmation is enough. Just a little bit more. This is why the gospel is so compelling, because if you get it, as Thomas Chalmers said in his sermon, The Expulsive Power of a New Affection, that affirmation thing, that person, that thing sitting on the throne of your life which most resolves your life is Jesus, and he stays. Where every other affirmation, every other king or monarch that wants to sit on the throne of your heart, age shifts it, experience shifts it out. Jesus himself stays. I think that's why we've got an opportunity. And Alan O. Noble, what a great name. I call him O. Noble Alan, so he sounds like knightly. Has written a book called You Are Not Your Own, Living for God in an Inhuman World. And he says, if I am my own and belong to myself, then I must define who I am. My parents can name me and the government can issue me a social security number, but only I can decide my identity. The contemporary understanding of humanity decrees that each of us has the freedom and responsibility to define that identity. Who can bear the weight of that? You must define who you are. And if that changes in 5 years, just shove the old self down the memory hole and come up with something new. Launder, rinse, repeat. It decrees that you have the freedom to do it, but also the responsibility to do it. And when it fails, you don't have anyone to blame except yourself. And Mark Sayers says that we're drowning in freedoms, but thirsting for meaning. The meaning bucket is empty, while the freedoms bucket, the Mindari Key bucket, is full. So there's the fragility of the self that's risen during the post-Christian framework. Keller also says the fading of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a Christian idea. It wasn't there in the Roman Empire. It was a shame and honour culture. And he says we're getting that back. The new shame and honour culture either produces a heavy, inquisitorial, merit forgiveness approach or leads people to abandon forgiveness altogether. That's why his last book, I think, was his most crucial. It was called Forgive. How can I and why should I? And I read a blog by a Christian lady who said, we all know we should forgive. But Tim Keller's right. No, we don't. We should cancel. There are people that don't deserve to be forgiven. I've read blogs by post-Christian people who are saying, not that they were ever Christian, we've got to get rid of this mask of power called forgiveness that the church has used to dominate people. It's a cancel culture. That's the way it is. And when I spoke to a Scripture Union rep who was asking me for some help for scripts for something she was doing for young people, I said, what are the 3 questions that teenagers are asking? And she said, meaning and purpose, could have got that. Identity, could have got that. Forgiveness. They're dead scared of getting cancelled by their friends and having no way back. As I told you the story about my lapsed Irish Catholic friend, forgiveness, it's a category shift. And Keller says that one of the major discipleship things we'll have to do if people become Christian is show them that forgiveness is a good thing and how to do it. And older Christians go, oh, I've got to forgive. I don't want to forgive, but I know I have to. Younger people who aren't Christian, who become Christian, won't even think that that's what they're supposed to do. Good thing we're such a forgiving community, we can model it to them, right? Yeah. Okay, we're not great, but let's not bag out the church. We've got the tools to do it, and when we do it well, it's done amazingly. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. And Glenn Scrivener says, in order to pursue the kingdom without the king, we have had to dethrone the person of Christ and install abstract values instead. The problem should be obvious. Persons can forgive you. Values cannot. Values can only judge you. So when you get the kingdom without the king, you get lots of judgy, but you don't get much forgiveness when you get it wrong. The church is an amazing place because it's got the tools in their armoury to forgive. But I want to go back to this, and then I'll talk about forgiveness as we finish. Rory again. We're not argued into expressive individualism, we're formed into it, and blah, 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 blah. The last 4 words are the words that I want to point to. God is framed out. That's secularism. Secularism is not jackboots down the streets like chick publications, stealing your Bibles and putting you up against the wall and shooting you. It's just framing God out, making him light, an opinion, not a fact. And the solution for Christians, as you look at that list, is not Christian Pixar or Christian Disney. It may not even be a graduation speech by the kind of ropey Christian who's sort of giving you a moralistic, therapeutic, deistic view of God in a Year 12 student at the end of a Christian school year. Or Christian novels. Here's the answer. Frame God in. Frame him in. Christians, every day you live your life, frame him into your life in such a way that it eventually just becomes so second nature that other people go, oh, it's a bit weird. Be weirder. Frame him in. No, not, I've got a friend who's a psychiatrist who worked at a university, and every Monday he had to catch himself when he was leading the team at the start of the day on Monday because he nearly opened the meeting in prayer. Imagine that at a university psychiatric department. We've got a live one here on floor 3, get them out of here. But frame God in. Do it together. Around your meals. When you're having non-Christian friends over, if you have non-Christian friends over, make sure it happens. Mix it up a bit. Just act as if God is framed in and that there isn't a dome like that closed over. The story of how you live your life will be the most compelling thing to people as they hear you talk about God and things in a way that they had not anticipated. And forgiveness. I told that story about my mum at the start of her life, right? And let me tell you a story when my dad did leave my mum, when my mum was 40, and left her for someone who was 23, and had a couple more kids. Mum never saw him again for 20-odd years, and he left Jesus behind as he drove off that day, just before I started university. And she prayed for him all the time. She forgave him, costly though that was. The worst day was when we came home from church one day and Dad had come to the house and taken his record player and records, and Mum sat on the floor, and there was an old Yorkshire lady, Mrs. Gallup, who, if she'd cried ever in her life, she would have rusted. And she rusted on the floor with Mum. And Mum didn't see Dad for 20 years and prayed for him all the time that he'd come back to God and ask for forgiveness. And one day on her birthday, she got a phone call 20 years later. I never prayed for Dad. That wasn't going to happen. God wasn't big enough to forgive. Or him to get him to forgive. That's not what I said. But clearly my actions proved that God was framed out of that part of my life. And Dad asked for forgiveness. His second marriage had fallen apart. He'd done exactly the same thing to his next two boys. Got in a car and drove away. And Mum forgave him. No, I didn't get back together. It was never going to happen. And she looked after him because he then started to get dementia at an early age and ended up in a locked ward at 69 and died at 73. And she would visit him, take him food every week, clear out his stuff. And one day I went in to see Dad and I walked into the room, hit by the smell. Two things you do in an aged care facility. Well, one thing. Two things. Put on hand sanitizer, and don't sit in the cloth chairs. And the smell overpowered me. Dad had soiled himself. By this stage, he had Lewy body dementia, so he was so far gone. And Mum was there, cleaning the floor. And I'd get an orderly. And she said, I've got this. I've got this. That's what forgiveness looks like. Because Jesus said, look what they've done all over the floor. But I've got this. So the most powerful thing in our story is that part of the story, right? And you can have all of the intellectual arguments that could get us back standing on the table again with 2 pints, but it's the deep story of the gospel of forgiveness that's going to change people in Australia in the future. From now. When I wrote that story, the amount of people that responded to it about their own stories of forgiveness, how they need to forgive someone, because that's something about the gospel. So I'm Mr., supposedly intellectual, it's all faux intellectualism, but nothing beats standing here saying, Jesus loves you and died for your sins. And the most woke person in the world knows they're not right. You just got to scratch the surface. I'll tell you a story about that tomorrow. But framing God in starts with that story. So I want to encourage you that it's not all one-way traffic. God's still working. That's how it feels. It started off with a fight, and it ends with forgiveness. I think that's how it can still keep going today.